Thanks, everyone. I want to open with some statistics to really give people a scope of this crisis. Preliminary data says we're going to be at about 59,000 deaths in 2016 from drug overdose, mostly due to opiate fatality. Just to give you a sense, that number exceeds by a third number of fatalities in the peak years of the AIDS crisis, leading cause of death in America for people under 50. All drug crises, drug epidemics require a marriage of law enforcement talent, public health talent. So my first question to you guys is kind of like a couples therapy question, really. What could each of you be doing better? Meaning, where do you think public health needs to step up? Where do you think law enforcement is lagging?
So I get to talk about what he does.
Yeah,
well, you probably
know. You get to criticize him.
You probably know, Gina, that the city has recently launched a new initiative tackling the opioid epidemic called Healing NYC, which joins law enforcement activities and health department activities as well as other agencies. A key thing that our police department is working on right now is making sure that people are aware of Good Samaritan laws. I think it's really important that people understand when they call for help and are helping somebody who's overdosing, if they were also using, that they should not be at risk, that they have been helping to save a life. And I think that it's important that people in law enforcement make clear that we want people to help people who are overdosing so that they survive and have a chance to recover. We also, of course, need interdiction of the large suppliers. This has been a heroin market in New York City for a very long time. It's difficult to do, but it's obviously a law enforcement activity and not a public health activity.
What do you think, Chuck?
I think there's a lot of things we can do better in law enforcement. I do want to note, because I think it's kind of cool, that we're invited to these types of discussions where maybe a decade ago we wouldn't be.
Together, you mean?
Together, yeah. Because the way I think of it, and my background is that of a federal prosecutor, we're not going to prosecute or enforce our way out of this. We need to change the culture. We need to teach. We need to educate. We certainly need to rehabilitate. Now, that is not in the main what we do at the DEA, of course, but it's a part of what we try and teach. And we have a demand reduction piece to the DEA, of which I'm very proud.
And what is that?
Well, it's a couple of things. One program we sponsor is our National Take-Back program. We know that 4 out of 5 heroin users start on prescription pills, and we know we're the biggest consumer of prescription pills in the universe. And so getting people to clean out their medicine cabinets in a way that's safe and anonymous. We do 2 take-backs a year. The last one we did was in April. And folks around the country at 5,200 sites brought back 900,000 pounds of drugs. And we simply incinerate it. We don't read labels. We don't try and make cases out of it. We just incinerate it. And that's a good thing. We need to do more like that.
Do you agree, Mary? Is that something that's actually valuable?
No, absolutely. We need to address the fact that people are getting prescribed too many opioid painkillers by their providers, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But people have this stuff sitting in their cabinets. Probably many people in this room. You went to a dentist and ended up with a 30-day supply of an opioid painkiller. That shouldn't be sitting in your cabinet, and safely disposing it is something that law enforcement can help us with. Not everybody feels comfortable walking into a law enforcement setting, so others have stepped forward to help with this. Some of the pharmacy chains in New York City have bins where you can just go in and dump it, so getting a way to safely dispose of it. And I could talk more about what public health should be doing that we're not doing, because I think that public health is really late to this conversation about how to tackle opioid overdose, but let me know if you want me to talk about that. I thought you were going to tell me what I should do.
Yeah, tell her what she's doing.
No, I think the way Mary thinks about it, and I think what this city does, is cutting edge. So I'm not going to sit here and tell Mary how to run her shop.
Okay. We have seen through legislation at the state level that prescription painkillers are going down, despite the fact that, yes, you can have a wisdom tooth pulled and have this ridiculously big prescription. The real problem now in cities, especially, I think, is that we are getting from China and Mexico pure fentanyl, manufactured fentanyl, which is a a drug for late-stage cancer patients. It's much, much, much more potent than morphine. It's coming now laced with heroin. It's incredibly deadly. And it is responsible now for most of these fatalities we're seeing that's really driving the death rates up. What are we doing, what are you doing to really choke this supply coming in from China and Mexico?
Yeah, so it's coming from China.
Okay.
And it comes into the United States either through Mexico, through normal, I hate to use the word normal here, but through traditional trafficking routes, or directly into the United States by users here who can order it off the dark web, shipped directly to their homes. So that's the two ways it gets here.
And how can we, how do we regulate the dark web? That seems like an enormous problem.
How much time do you have? But it comes from China. And so one of the things we've done, in fact, I was recently in China, I was there in January, working with our Chinese counterparts, and that might sound a little bit unusual, but at a law enforcement level, we're actually doing okay. And two things happened as a result of our conversations with them. First, Ginia, the Chinese have scheduled a bunch of fentanyl analogs, banning it from export from China. Now, that doesn't stop it entirely, of course, but it gives Chinese authorities...
But it had been legal to it.
A tool, yes. And then the second thing, and this may surprise some folks, we're now passing lead information with our Chinese counterparts. They've given us information to help us make criminal cases at a high level in the United States. So when you say choke it off, that seems like that's a long way away, because we have to change the demand culture. But we are making cases in the United States with the cooperation of our Chinese law enforcement counterparts. And that's different, and that's new.
Okay. And what can municipal law enforcement do? Both of you, you work with the NYPD. Where do you think municipal law enforcement can really help combat this fentanyl problem?
Me again?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just...
Go ahead.
Hand it off to Mary in a moment. But the local officers, the sheriffs, and the firefighters, and the cops, the first responders, they're the ones who are primarily going to be responding with Narcan or naloxone and treating people who have overdosed.
And maybe just explain what that is for people who might not be as familiar with the subject. Yeah.
Naloxone is an opioid inhibitor. It reverses the effects of an overdose. Narcan is a brand name, so we really should talk about it as naloxone. But our first responders around the country are now equipped with naloxone, and they are the ones who are going to be treating and saving lives. I'm sure that happens every day in New York City.
Sure. Sure. So I thought you were talking about the interdiction of drug entry into the city, and our NYPD echoes what Chuck has just said, that this fentanyl is coming from rogue laboratories. It's not being diverted from legal sources in the United States. It's coming mostly from China, but it is also entering these traditional routes and the traditional pathways of heroin into the city. So that's something that law enforcement has been working on for decades. Unfortunately, people who are opioid dependent, in my experience as a medical doctor, find a way to find opioids. And so the goal here is first to make sure that people survive opioid use, and second, that they find their way into treatment. And that's a really important part of what we're talking about in New York City, and one that is the first time any of us can remember that a political figure, an elected representative, our mayor, stood up and said that people need to have more access to treatment. That means buprenorphine, methadone. We talked about naloxone, and there was a picture of a syringe. I don't know how many of the audience is looking at us or looking at the screen. And that was a naloxone vial. It's given intranasally, and that cone at the end there was what you stick into somebody's nose. And what people die of with opioid overdoses is that they can't breathe. Their respiratory centers are suppressed. And naloxone displaces opioids. And it's like a miracle. Anybody who's ever reversed someone will never forget it, because people simply wake up. And first-line responders in New York City, half have been trained, and we have a commitment under this new initiative that all patrol officers will carry naloxone so that they can reverse overdoses. But we also want to get it in the hands of people who are in the networks of users, family, friends. We're distributing it through our syringe exchange programs, for example, because the idea is that you can survive an overdose. And the way to survive an overdose is to have available naloxone. If you don't have it with you, you should call for help, call 911. But if you have it, then you can save a life.
Go ahead.
And this may sound odd to some members of the audience, but we have trained DEA special agents, almost a quarter of our law enforcement cadre, on the administration of naloxone, not because we are traditionally first responders, typically we are not, but because I worry all the time about our folks encountering fentanyl, car fentanyl on the streets. Aerosolized, it can be accidentally inhaled, and we've had a couple of incidents now around the country where law enforcement officers had to be treated with Narcan to save their lives due to accidental exposure to fentanyl. We recently put out an alert to all first responders, cops, sheriffs, EMTs, and firefighters, that they may have to be treating themselves with this if they accidentally bump into it. That's how lethal it is.
It is, I mean, it was an unusual circumstance.
In Hartford?
In Hartford, I
Yeah.
think it was a place where they had a lot of fentanyl around, which is, usually it's mixed in street drugs in New York City. We now, let me just give a few statistics for New York City, that we now have a New Yorker dying of a drug overdose every 7 hours. So when we use the word an epidemic, it's used advisedly. And we are now seeing this public discussion about opioid use, and that's taking place in a way that never happened before, with a real air of compassion, which I think we have to attribute to the shifting demographics of the using population. But the fact is that fentanyl entered the drug market late, the street drug market late in New York City. We just started seeing it in our street drug supply and in overdose deaths in the past year. And now, nearly half of our drug overdose deaths have fentanyl in the picture. It's really scary.
So we haven't seen a reduction in fatalities from the naloxone?
No, it's going up. We had 1,374 deaths confirmed in 2016, our most recent data, and that's up from 937. That's an additional 450 or so lives. The uptick we attribute largely to fentanyl. I don't know, and the fact that our street drugs are just much more lethal. That's why getting the word out about naloxone and the ability to reverse overdoses is so important.
I don't disagree. I can give you a national figure. So it's a little frustrating that our data lags, but the last year for which we have complete data is 2015. And in 2015, there were 52,000 deaths nationwide. We think about 2/3 attributable to opioids, and of course some portion of that attributable to fentanyl. But big numbers have a tendency to wash over people.
Right.
We don't even know what 52,000 looks like, other than perhaps a capacity crowd at Yankee Stadium plus a few more. But think of it this way. About a year ago, we had that awful incident at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and 49 innocent people were murdered. Imagine that happening 3 times a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once in the evening. And then imagine that happening for 365 days in a row. And you don't have to do the math, I've already done it for you. That's about 52,000. That's what it looks like. It's utterly staggering. And here's why, and I know Mary knows this, but as I mentioned, 4 out of 5 heroin users start on prescription pills, but we're the biggest consumer of prescription pills in the world. And once you get hooked on a pill, it gets really expensive to sustain that habit on the street. Heroin is 1/5, 1/6 the price. And so there's a causative and correlative relationship between pill addiction and heroin addiction. And then, by the way, fentanyl is even easier, because you make it in a lab. You don't have to grow it, you don't have to harvest it, you don't have to cultivate it, you just have to order it. And that's why we're seeing this migration from pills to heroin with fentanyl. and Lord knows what comes next.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point of the lack of awareness of how big the crisis is. I was speaking to former Police Commissioner Bill Bratton a few months ago, and I said, why during the crack crisis, we saw this incredible rise in crime? Opioid crisis is correlated with the reduction, of lowered crime rates around the country for many reasons. We don't see the opioid crisis in certain, in many parts of cities because we're not stepping over crack piles, we're not experiencing the crime. Has that in a way had a perverse effect on how we've dealt with the crisis because there is not this kind of, public outrage, public outcry, will to overcome the way there was then? Do you guys have
I'm local. New York City is a big local, but it is one jurisdiction. And I would say Staten Island has really locked arms and said that this is unacceptable for our community. They have a local newspaper that has put it on their front pages on a weekly basis. And the community has really risen up and said, we need to address this. And they've adopted all the elements that the health department proposes: naloxone distribution, working with their healthcare providers to reduce unnecessary prescribing of opioids, which Chuck just said, has opened a door to opioid dependence that hadn't been opened before, this quadrupling of prescription drugs, and also encouraging access to treatment. And the last one is the part that I've gotten especially interested in. But certainly we've seen it in some communities. We haven't seen it all over the city, but I think that there are communities that are really hurting. Staten Island is certainly one of them. There are other communities in New York City that are also hurting, but some of those communities have been the site of what I describe an endemic
like the Bronx,
heroin,
as we've
like the
discussed
Bronx.
before.
So, part of it probably is the shifting demographics. I'll leave crime statistics to the police officers, but we have the typical opioid user is now a white man between 40 and mid-50s. It's not what many people may imagine from the way the media has handled descriptions of heroin epidemics in the past. And, people who need drugs need drugs. Anyone can become dependent on these drugs, but I think that the drive to get the money to support their habits has shifted with the demographics of the epidemic. Do you agree with that? That's just a hypothesis. I don't know.
So we see something a little bit different nationwide, and the way I typically answer the question is that there is no typical answer. In other words, it seems to cut across race and gender and age. We see it from 20 to 70, and there are parts of the country, particularly east of the Mississippi, that are very hard hit. They are what tend to be white powder heroin markets. This is sort of a broad stroke, but west of the Mississippi, the heroin markets tend to be brown and black tar heroin, and so not easily laced with fentanyl. East of the Mississippi, they tend to be white powder heroin markets.
And how did all of this pure heroin come to flood this part of the country?
You mean, why is there a preference for white powder?
How did it get here?
Again, well, how it got here is from cartels in Mexico profiting off of, substance abuse. But why a white powder market east of the Mississippi and a black and brown tar west? I don't know. Cultural differences, preferences. But what we're seeing in places like Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky is what Mary describes in Staten Island, an outcry, an outrage, because so many people are dying.
And it's very visible.
And it's very visible. In fact, a recent statistic I saw suggested that 1 out of 200 children born in the United States now are born with symptoms of opiate withdrawal. And hospitals, particularly in West Virginia and Ohio, are becoming, sadly, specialists in treating those children. That's how widespread it is.
Chuck, I want to ask you a question. The DEA has come under some criticism for failing or slowing down under its administrative division the lawsuits of civil litigation of these middlemen distributors that would get the pills, opioid pills, oxy, all this stuff, and get it to these, you know, back channel distributors. Do you think we'd be in a much better place if the DEA had been more aggressive at that level?
Yeah, and I don't want to sound overly defensive here. When I testified in Congress about this, I said I thought we could do better. I still think we can do better, but that doesn't mean we were doing poorly. We bring lots of administrative cases. We are a regulator as well as a law enforcement agency, and we've recently had a number of very, very large settlements, civil settlements with distributors, McKesson and Cardinal Health and the like, for failing to abide by DEA and Controlled Substance Act regulations. So look, can we do better, Ginia? Yes, absolutely. Could we bring more administrative cases more quickly? I believe so. But I also think from a regulatory standpoint, we've done quite well recently.
You know, health departments, not my health department, but for example, the Chicago Health Department brought a case against the pharmaceutical industry. Right. Because making the case that they knew or should have known that they were promoting highly addictive drugs for pain that could be managed appropriately with non-opioid painkillers. So none of them have been successful, but I just wanted to mention that the public health community has sought to address not only the prescriber, who, after all, it was prescribers who helped to make drug names like Percocet, OxyContin, Vicodin, household names and best-selling drugs. But they did it with the avid encouragement of pharmaceutical companies, and I think that it's important for us to talk about that as well. Right.
We're going to move to questions in about 2 minutes, but one final. Vancouver is a city that has started safe injection sites. So the city runs places where people can come and consume their drugs safely. Basically, they can monitor and make sure people aren't dying. It really has not slowed the fatality rate. People are still dying. Do you think this is something that will take on, you know, take hold in other cities? And what are your feelings about the ethics of it?
Well, the city has commissioned a study on safe injection facilities in New York City, and it's not done yet, but it will get done, and it examines both the stakeholders and community acceptability, the modeled impact, and I believe in Vancouver they were able to show in a circumscribed area that there was a reduction in deaths, and certainly there were never any deaths in these facilities. And additionally looked at the legal framework, because there are serious legal barriers to these facilities. My own view is that they fit within the tradition of harm reduction. At the moment, we make syringes available to people that they are told how to safely inject drugs, how to clean their skin. These came into acceptance because
these are in city clinics.
We have many of them, scores of syringe exchange programs around the city. And we adopted these because people were getting HIV through needle sharing and unsafe use of injections. So then they go inject in parks and bathrooms and bus stations, on buses, and sometimes people die of their injections. So I view it as something that's interesting. I'm grateful that the City Council gave the health department some funding to look at this. It's used in Europe and Australia, but I think there is no jurisdiction in the United States that currently has a safe injection facility, and New York City has no plans at this time to have one.
Okay, let's move to some audience questions. Adam.
Right, and we are streaming this session on Facebook Live, and we're getting some questions from the audience there. The first one is from Alyssa Batsios. What is the role of institutional racism in the so-called war on drugs? How do we address this very damaging force?
Well, that's a very big question, but one that I think I alluded to a little bit, and I'm going to assume this is a question for me. I spend a lot of time talking about race and racism. that of course the whole tone of the conversation about opioid use has shifted as the people who are bearing the burden of opioid use has changed. We know, for example, that marijuana use is about the same among blacks and whites, but the likelihood of ending up arrested and in jail for marijuana use is far greater if you're black. So I would say that we all need to acknowledge the role of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. But I also think that we have to acknowledge how important this shift in tone is, and that I certainly wouldn't complain that we have this shift in tone because we now have opioid users who are also white.
That's great. I saw a hand go up over there from the audience. In front here, please. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Iris Barr. Pardon my ignorance, but how easy is it to get chemically dependent on these opioids? Like, what is the percentage of the average person who suffers from chronic pain due to an injury that ends up becoming a hardcore user? And if it is highly, dependent, chemically, not like they weren't a previous addict, is there any movement to make these drugs illegal, or is that kind of?
I don't know, we probably both have something to say about this.
Why don't you go first?
All right, so one of the big myths that was part of the promotion of use of opioids for non-cancer pain is that people who have real pain don't become dependent on these drugs. And as soon as you stop, you will be fine. The fact is that anyone can become dependent on these drugs biologically, and the proportion is somewhere around 70% to 3/4 of people will become dependent with long-term use. So it really was a myth that there was such a thing as long-term use of opioids without dependence. It just is not true. And that's why we see this opening of the door from opioid painkillers with people moving to heroin and inadvertently to fentanyl.
At the other end of the spectrum, you and I could both be prescribed prescription pills for pain, same type, same dosage. First time either of us have ever taken something like that, so no history of opioid use, and I become addicted in a weekend, and nothing at all bad happens to you. It's very individualistic, and I've talked with folks who've become addicted and who are in treatment and rehab, and they say in some cases it happens as quickly as a few days. I'm not an expert here, but I think I think the answer varies widely across the user population. Is that your experience, Mary?
Sure, but I think that the main thing is that we are hugely overprescribing these drugs, and that pain can be adequately managed with non-opioid painkillers, and that's how they should be managed. And in New York City, we've provided guidelines. We are taking a page from the pharmaceutical industry and have people going door to door to practices to talk with doctors about reducing the prescription of opioids.
Just that point, we're 5% of the world's population as Americans. We consume, I don't mean ingest, we use, consume, store, buy 99% of the world's hydrocodone and about 80% of the world's oxycodone. How can something bad not happen?
Another question from Facebook Live from Kashif Prasada. Do you think expanded and free access to methadone, Suboxone, and naloxone will help reduce the number of overdoses in the community?
Certainly, we need expanded access to all three of those. Certainly. The naloxone would reverse overdoses, and acknowledging that people need medication-assisted treatment, that we need to destigmatize it and we need to increase access to it is part of dealing with this epidemic.
Okay.
So, hand go up in the front here. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Pat Davis. I'm a city councilor in Albuquerque. A former police officer, actually, and worked on some DEA task forces back in the day. Today, our city, we're doing all the things you should be doing. All our first responders have naloxone. We partner with our feds to do interdiction work. Our public health process has needle exchanges. But it's incredibly frustrating from a public policy perspective that all these are sort of reactive to the larger problem of prescriptions. And it's frustrating as we see these drug companies making record profits and passing the consequences of cleaning up that mess on to taxpayers in the city with other priorities. What are the real public policy opportunities for us in the next few years to really address this on a broader scale beyond cities looking at short-term localized projects?
Well, I don't disagree with anything that you've said. I think you've framed it really well. We don't support banning these medications because they have a real medical purpose. They just should be used for appropriate indications. And I also share the view that it is the person prescribing to the patient in front of them who can best determine that. So we need to educate prescribers. That includes, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and physicians in appropriate, what we call judicious prescribing. And we need to reel in this idea that pain is the fourth vital sign, that none of your patients should ever experience pain, and give them an opioid to make sure they don't. The pharmaceutical companies need to take a responsible approach to marketing their products.
And I know we're out of time, but I'll add one thing. I think we need a more robust prescription drug monitoring program. Some of you may know that 49 of 50 states participate, but the interconnectivity between, and so it's not mandated. Yeah. The interconnectivity between states is catch as catch can. There's some degree of interconnectivity between roughly 36 states. But what this enables prescribers to do, and I'm talking about
we have it in New York.
Responsible prescribers, is to check a database to see whether you have filled 18 prescriptions for oxycodone in the last 2 weeks and that you've picked them up at pharmacies all over the Northeast. And until we have that degree of interconnectivity with proper constraints on how law enforcement and regulators would access it, we're just missing a lot of stuff. And so I think a more robust prescription drug monitoring program would be helpful.
All right. On that note, thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. We have iStop here.